workshop and conference to this transformation to this digital forum due to the global pandemic. And it's been always rewarding, however, and with dedicated colleagues who never were short of brilliant ideas. I'd like to thank everyone involved at both institutions, but particularly Pablo Jose Ramirez, adjunct curator of First Nations and Indigenous Art of Hyundai Tate Research Center Transnational, and also Julio Garcia Murillo, Deputy Director of Public Programs of MUAC, for their imaginative and also very meticulous organization. The forum started this Tuesday, and it is taking place over 3 weeks and through 3 thematic lines of geopoetics, chronotopes, and enunciations. Each thematic part consists of keynote speech, essays, panel discussion, and artist studio visit. Today's panel discussion is part of Geopoetics. Under the title of Plurivers at the Edges of the West, curators Itzel Vargas and Candice Hawkins will speak about what questions and challenges Indigenous contemporary art raises in the context of exhibitions and also museum practice that are often Western-centric and universalizing. Our first speaker, Itzel Vargas, is currently the curator-in-chief of the Museo Universitario del Chopo. She has worked with many artists, including Thomas Glassford, Pablo Helguera, Nerva Cuevas, Tania Candiani, and Ivan Argote, among others. She was also previously the director of research for Mexico City's Museo de Arte Moderno and curator of Casa del Lago Juan José Areola, as well as the director of Museo del Palacio de Bellas Artes. The second speaker is Candice Hawkins, who is a curator and writer of Tlingit descent, originally from Whitehorse, Yukon. She's currently senior curator of the Toronto Biennial of Art. Candice was also a co-curator of the 2018 Santa Fe Biennale and a part of the curatorial team for Documenta 14 in Athens and Kassel, as well as a co-curator of Sakahan, a major international exhibition of Indigenous art at the National Gallery of Canada. After their presentations, I'll chair a discussion amongst us and also moderate a Q&A session with you, all the audience. And please send in your comment and questions throughout the presentations and discussion. We'll do our best to accommodate as many questions as possible. And lastly, please join me in welcoming Itzel Vargas. Itzel.
Buenos días y buenas tardes a todos. Gracias, Suk. Quiero agradecer al MUAC, a Amanda de la Garza, a Julio García Murillo, a Pablo José Ramírez del Hyundai Tate Research Center por la invitación a estar presente en este foro. Me da mucho gusto compartirlo contigo, Suk, y con Candice. Como lo explicó el etnólogo y antropólogo Guillermo Bonfil Batalla, indígena es una categoría impuesta, enraizada en la opresión. En su acepción está implícita la condición del colonizado, la marginación y el sometimiento. Es preciso hablar de los pueblos por su nombre: ayuk, purépechas, nahuas, mayas, zapotecos, mixtecos, y dejar de asumir la oposición binaria mestizos e indígenas, porque la distinción es simplista y errónea. Obedece a una construcción nacionalista que ha perdurado desde la invasión de los españoles a este territorio hoy conocido como México. La exposición Los Huecos del Agua, Arte Actual de Pueblos Originarios, se inauguró en mayo de 2019 en el Museo Universitario del Chopo, en la Ciudad de México. La exposición estuvo conformada por obras de artistas relacionados a pueblos originarios por autoidentificación, lugar de residencia, nacimiento o uso de la lengua. Es pertinente mencionar que desde 2012 el Museo Universitario del Chopo desarrolla distintas líneas de trabajo relacionadas con las culturas de pueblos originarios, cuestionando las posturas paternalistas y asistencialistas con las que hasta entonces se abordaban estos temas. Como ejemplo, en 2013, el museo inauguró la exposición de Fernando Palma, No relampagueó para anunciar que llovería tu hermosura, y desde 2014 celebra el Festival Internacional de Música Contemporánea en diversas lenguas, estruendo multilingüe. Una de las intenciones medulares del trabajo curatorial de Los Huecos del Agua fue romper con la idea homogeneizadora del indígena, que funciona como una unidad cultural, sin diferencias o particularidades. De ahí que el título de la muestra buscó referir al pensamiento archipiélago del poeta, novelista, dramaturgo y ensayista Édouard Glissant, fundamentado en la diversidad del mundo, que se propone como un contrapeso a la unicidad de los sistemas de pensamiento occidentales. La exposición reflexiona sobre la circunstancia actual de los pueblos originarios, enmarcada por la amenaza de proyectos extractivistas avalados por el Estado, el desplazamiento de sus territorios, la castellanización forzada, la extrema pobreza, la discriminación, el racismo y el ecocidio, entre otros problemas que amenazan sus derechos y autonomía. De ahí que el programa público de la exposición incluyó conferencias y diálogos relacionados al activismo y derechos de la mujer en pueblos originarios, crítica a la historiografía de la conquista, resistencia de pueblos originarios para la defensa de sus acervos lingüísticos, textiles y territoriales, proyectos comunitarios, imagen y resistencia zapatista, radios comunitarias, además de proyecciones de cine y video. Para la labor curatorial resultó imperativo alejarse de cualquier forma de extractivismo cultural, colonizante, complaciente, idealizador o fundamentado en el folclore, para optar por obras que testimoniaran las complejidades que aquejan a este grupo de artistas. Lo anterior asumiendo la responsabilidad de que al folclorizar también se despolitiza. Se asume que cada artista constituye un universo en sí mismo. Sin embargo, en su práctica predomina la negociación entre un pasado que reconocen como propio y la construcción de un presente saturado de cruces culturales y problemáticas sociales. Hay un diálogo con lo global, con el mundo contemporáneo. Existe experimentación y riesgo. Por supuesto, la práctica de estos artistas no se vincula necesariamente con lo precolombino. El pensamiento y el modo de vida de los pueblos originarios no son estáticos ni están aislados. Conservan idiosincrasias, sentidos y actividades de culturas anteriores a la invasión de los peninsulares. Pero continúa la generación de saberes, manifestaciones culturales, perspectivas de vida comunal, intercambios intelectuales, políticos y sociales desde el presente. Ana Hernández, artista nacida en Santo Domingo de Tehuantepec, en Oaxaca, ha desarrollado iniciativas alrededor de la recuperación de la vestimenta y ornamentos del Istmo de Tehuantepec. Lluvia Dorada es una pieza vertical que recupera la manufactura de un tocado de pelo hecho con papel dorado, procedimiento ya en desuso. El tocado original constaba de 3 elementos de apenas unos cuantos centímetros que se colocaba en el pelo. Para esta exposición, Ana desarrolló esta pieza titulada Lluvia Dorada, donde está replicando ese proceso de manufactura, obviamente a gran escala. El procedimiento para desarrollar estos tocados o esta técnica ya estaba en desuso. Y para la realización de la obra, Ana Hernández buscó a las últimas 2 personas que conocían la técnica, quienes tuvieron que a su vez compartirla con familiares y con amigos para poder lograr alcanzar este formato. De esta manera se reactivó un conocimiento que estaba en vías de desaparecer. En otra pieza de su autoría, el bordado titulado Rutas de Ausencia, Aborda la sensación de pérdida y sufrimiento que conllevan los procesos migratorios. Aquí Hernández realizó un tejido con aguja de gancho que, como ven, representa el mapa de la República Mexicana y la frontera con Estados Unidos. Ahí las flores marcan la distancia entre el lugar de residencia del artista y la nueva localización de su madre, quien tuvo que emigrar. Cuando Ana recibió la primera carta de su madre con la referencia de esta dirección, se volvió una referencia completamente abstracta. El vínculo con el medio ambiente y la referencia al ecocidio están presentes en autores como Sabino Guizu. Él es proveniente de Juchitán de Zaragoza, Oaxaca, que en su serie Dead Honey de 2010 señala cómo la disminución de la población de abejas ha repercutido en el medio ambiente global. Esta serie no solo se conformaba por el cráneo inundado de miel, también realizó una serie de pinturas de gran formato, donde emplea el humo como una de las herramientas. También constaba de un video y un mapa hecho con enjambres del mundo sobre una mesa que estaba cubierta de miel. Por su parte, Fernando Palma incorpora la robótica a su práctica artística para promover el regreso a conocimientos originarios y así incidir de manera positiva en los modos de vida contemporáneos. Este posicionamiento también es ejercido desde el activismo y su proyecto Calculite Calco, una iniciativa que desde hace más de 20 años promueve la revitalización del conocimiento ancestral de los pueblos indígenas del sur de la cuenca del Anáhuac. Respecto a su interacción con el medio ambiente, facilitan reservas naturales y sistemas agrícolas sustentables. Las nociones de relación de los seres humanos con la naturaleza están presentes en el concepto de la comunalidad, trabajado por el antropólogo zapoteco Jaime Martínez Luna y el antropólogo mije Floriberto Díaz Gómez. Reyes Joaquín Maldonado, proveniente de Sinanche, Yucatán, en su pieza Horizontes 4 de 2019, hace referencia al nombre que se le da a las distintas capas de suelo y toma como referencia las perforaciones del cráter de Chicxulub en Yucatán para extraer cilindros de roca que provean de información sobre la restauración de los ecosistemas después del impacto de un meteorito. El artista alude a la huella ecológica, resultado de modos de vida actuales y cómo impactan en la contaminación del subsuelo. La fotógrafa Maruch Santis Gómez, nacida en Crustón, San Juan Chamula, Chiapas, en sus series fotográficas y icónicas Creencias 1 y 2, recoge las supersticiones, actividades propiciatorias y remedios de su comunidad. Las fotografías están montadas con textos en castellano y tzotzil. Algunos ejemplos de estos textos y de estas imágenes son no sentar a los niños en un tronco o una piedra, para curar a alguien que ronca mucho, no apretar la trompa de un perrito ni darle tamal. En contraposición, si bien hay artistas como Maruch que recuperan estas tradiciones y estos modos de pensamiento que pasan de boca en boca, también hay otra generación de artistas que está trabajando desde otros lugares con estas creencias, como es el caso de Abraham Gómez. Abraham Gómez nació en San Juan Chamula, en Chiapas. Esta es una serie titulada Le comenzó la locura, de 2013, donde realizó autorretratos, donde ejecuta actividades que de acuerdo a la superstición atentan contra su seguridad. Aquí, por ejemplo, aparece con el pelo cortado cuando se supone que no debería hacerlo, porque el pelo también forma parte del cuerpo, forma parte de un todo, igual que las uñas. También tiene otra de las fotografías, él está bebiendo agua directamente de un manantial, y entonces es algo que no debería suceder, porque quien bebe agua directo de un manantial está impidiendo que su alma descanse. Él me comentó que cuando realizó esta serie, pues se estaba poniendo en riesgo según sus creencias. Su mamá le dijo que dejara de hacerlo, que había un peligro inminente, y se cayó, se pegó muy fuerte en la cabeza, tuvo un accidente delicado, y había un perro ese día alrededor de él, mismo al que le tomó una fotografía. Y cuando salió del hospital y se recuperó, la madre le dijo, ese perro era tu mensajero, te estaba diciendo que dejaras de tentar a la suerte, ¿no? Entonces, esa fotografía del perro titulada Mensajero forma parte de esta serie. Por su parte, Octavio Aguilar nacido en Santiago, Zacatepec, en Ayuk Not Dead, registra la música y canto de la figura mítica del pueblo Mije Concoy. Incluye un conjunto de parches serigrafiados relacionados a la iconografía de la indumentaria punk e incluye fragmentos del canto Nayuk, además de imágenes provenientes de diferentes orígenes. La persona que aparece en el video del centro es su abuela. Y estos parches también él los utiliza no solamente dentro de esta obra, también ha impreso algunos de ellos que pone en circulación repartiéndolos entre la gente, al igual que algunas copias de sus videos, las inserta en el mercado informal. En su localidad hay puestos donde venden videos piratas, y él lo que hace es producir copias de sus propios videos y dejarlos en los puestos para que se consuman de esa manera. Ahora abro una cita de la lingüista, activista y pensadora Mije Yasnaya Elena Gil de 2018. Se calcula que a principios del siglo XIX, después de 300 años de colonialismo español, aproximadamente el 65% de la población del naciente Estado mexicano hablaba una de las muchas lenguas indígenas del país. Si ahora, después de 200 años de vida como Estado, los hablantes de lenguas indígenas representamos solo el 6.5% de la población, podemos decir que los pueblos indígenas no son pueblos minoritarios, sino minorizados, y que la aparente mayoría mestiza es en realidad población desindigenizada por el proyecto estatal. De seguir con la tendencia actual, en unos 100 años los pueblos indígenas representarán tan solo el 0.5% de la población mexicana, culminando así el proyecto estatal de homogeneización. El lingüicidio forma parte de las narrativas personales de varios de los autores, independientemente de sus geografías particulares. Así, José Chitzul recurre a la estética caligráfica proveniente del rótulo. Déjame, si están viendo la... Para escribir una serie de frases en maya y castellano, pintadas como una reafirmación de la identidad a través de la lengua. Estamos en un mundo de palabras, todos somos maya, estamos vivos, véanos, estamos escribiendo. Andy Medina, por su parte, realiza el video Torre de Babel, mediante imágenes de archivo de la construcción de las Torres Gemelas de Nueva York, mientras una voz en off, en Mije, narra un extracto de Génesis bíblico sobre la fundación de la Torre de Babel, como una referencia al uso de la lengua como mecanismo de poder. Sin duda, una de las obras más confrontativas es la instalación de Medina Liqui Ganalú, la que está apareciendo en este momento en la pantalla, compuesta por una banca de escuela con una de las patas más cortas, sostenida por publicaciones representativas de la educación estatal, la politización del niño mexicano, la Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos y un diccionario español-inglés. Como ven, el muro de enfrente, a manera de pizarrón, contiene la frase en zapoteco del Istmo de Oaxaca, Liqui Ganalú, cuya traducción es tú no sabes. Andy había hecho una serie previa cuyo texto decía, ahora tú eres el ignorante, que es un poco el mismo sentido que esta pieza. La lengua materna es un marco imprescindible para relacionarnos con otros seres humanos y para entender al mundo. La negación de este derecho humano fundamental constituye una de las violencias más atroces hacia los pueblos. porque además anula la posibilidad de tener acceso a otros derechos, como el derecho a la salud o a la justicia. La pieza es una crítica a la política estatal de imposición del castellano como única lengua oficial, mientras que para los espectadores no hablantes de zapoteco, al conocer la traducción del enunciado, se activa la posibilidad de empatizar, de ponernos en el lugar de aquellos que han sido discriminados y forzados, incluso con castigos físicos, a un sistema de comunicación ajeno, construido para conceptualizar el mundo de otros. Los Tlacolulocos es una dupla de artistas de Tlacolula de Morelos, de Matamoros, Oaxaca, conformada por Darío Canul y Cosijoesa Cernas, quienes señalan conflictos como el magisterial, la violencia o el tráfico de drogas y armas en el estado de Oaxaca. Las principales protagonistas de sus lienzos y murales son las mujeres, siempre en actitud combativa, ataviadas en trajes de la región y tenis de marcas norteamericanas, tatuajes y celulares. La mezcla de referentes inesperados potencian la representación de estos territorios de cruce, como en sus AK-47, que es la imagen que están viendo de la exposición, que están bien pintadas sobre petate o ensambladas con molinos de chocolate o piedras cercanas a las ruidas de Molte Albán. En cuanto al desplazamiento forzados de territorios, el artista César Catzú López, en su obra Los espíritus del río de San Pedro Xochicahuastla, Guerrero, aborda el concepto de espiritualidad desde la cultura de los amuzgos de la Costa Chica de Guerrero. En el 2016, en Xochislahuaca surgió un movimiento de los bienes naturales del territorio en complicidad con el gobierno estatal y federal. Los artistas seleccionados aluden a las tensiones que existen entre comunidades indígenas y el Estado. Señalan una historia continua de resistencia frente a la explotación y minorización de entidades comunitarias. La idealización y celebración de la multiculturalidad conlleva la apropiación indebida de sus patrimonios, a conveniencia de un proyecto nacionalista unívoco, reflejando la relación asimétrica con el poder del Estado. Debemos seguir trabajando en la escucha, desaprender certezas y formular preguntas sobre lo que asumimos de los otros. No existen desventajas por naturaleza. Es necesario construir desde la equidad y no desde una mexicanidad única, supuestamente compartida, porque también esta es una invención. El punto de partida deberá ser el reconocimiento de la diversidad como un conjunto de archipiélagos, territorios físicos, cognitivos o naciones que convivan en la afirmación de sus diferencias y en la autonomía de sus gobernanzas. Muchas gracias.
Second speaker is Candice Hawkins.
Hi, everyone. Just want to also give my gratitude to the organizers, Pablo, for inviting me. It was so nice to hear your presentation and to also be introduced to so many other artists. I'm speaking to you today from Tiwa territory in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I'm a guest in the lands adjacent to where my husband is from. And I'm going to be speaking about an idea that I've been thinking about for the past few years. And it's what I call repatriation otherwise. So as we know, the museum is a frame, but it's not a conventional one. Its edges can shift. It creates borders within borders. What can act as dividing lines between us and them, particularly when it comes to questions of ownership, rights, and the rehoming of our belongings. Here in the lands now known as Canada, where I come from, when conversations first began with museums regarding the repatriation or the return of our ancestors' bones, their bodies, as well as those things that were outright stolen or for the most part, sold under duress, this frame was used as the basis to refuse their return. The museum contains protocols, they said, certain conditions like climate and storage, certain knowledge and collections management that were not available in home communities. I want you to be aware of the inherent bias in these statements. These are coming from museums who don't know the protocols of these things. They might not know their makers, they might not know what they stand for, and they certainly don't know what is often their ceremonial role. It is also understood that when our belongings return, they're things transformed. When they entered museums, they became bound by their protocols, by museological protocols, protocols which they carried with them when they returned back to their places of origin. For a long time, I was interested in the excuses developed by museums as to why they couldn't give our things back, even when it's clear that they shouldn't have them in the first place and that they acquired them through dubious means. One of the first people to try to get our regalia back and the belongings from what are called the potlatch bands, which lasted for 63 years, was then Chief James Seward. He understood that these things are beings. That is, they are imbued with life and they have specific protocols of care. So in 1967, after the initial argument that they simply be returned failed, he offered to buy them back for the same price that they were originally sold to museums for. The Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto argued that Seaweed not only pay the purchase price of the objects, but also for their so-called care and restoration that they underwent while in their holdings. This reiterated that these were belongings that had been transformed. They carried the context of the museums back with them. And when they eventually did return home, and here's a new home that was made for them, which predicated their display, their use, and their care. As to some, even in their return, they seemed as though they were homesick. They were stuck, as it were, between worlds. So some of these returns predicated that a form of a museum be built to enable them to come back. And this is how Umista, this is an image of it here, in Alert Bay, which is a small island off the west coast of Canada, came to be. And while it adheres to some of the protocols of the museum, the community doesn't use that term. They refuse the term museum. They call it a cultural center instead. At the time, there were excuses given to evade repatriation. And some of those excuses that were given were that our belongings had become poisoned. They were sickened by the treatment of museums who would douse them with arsenic when they entered their holdings. And now they can't come home because they're too toxic. And another more complex narrative of refusal is also based on sickness and infection. This is especially telling in the age of a global pandemic. The idea that if they return, they will make us sick. So that is that these belongings may carry with them very old diseases that we no longer have immunities for. So colonial infection used as an excuse to keep those things that are not rightfully theirs. And the irony in this excuse doesn't seem lost on them. Our belongings have become their wealth, and many don't see value in their return. So this is the opening of Umista. You can see the people gathered there. The people gathered in front of the door are wearing their regalia, and they're welcoming the belongings home. So I'm beginning to think of the concept of repatriation otherwise. The idea that perhaps we have become too focused on the return of our things and what this might predicate, and that sometimes this might be another colonial trap, and that perhaps our frame of reference is also too predicated on colonial protocols of the museum instead of the protocols of the belonging itself, which they definitely acted in Umista. So what they did when they brought the potlatch items home is they displayed them in the order that they would be danced in ceremonies instead of some other more arbitrary order given by colonial museums. So the protocols of the belonging itself, not artifact, never artifact, and not objects either. These are things with agency. These are our cultural belongings. And perhaps the focus now does not always necessarily need to be on the return, but also on finding other ways of being with them, of making them a part of us, of our bodies, of our communities, of ourselves. I wonder if this is also part of the restore and the repair. In this way, repatriation starts to lose some of its fixity. It becomes more malleable. It's something that we can shape for our own uses and our own ends as Indigenous people. I'm thinking of those who mobilize the potential of belonging as a form of bringing it closer to home. The artist Tanya Lukin Linklater and her collaborators set this in motion recently. She did this first by making a link between the absent body of the gut-skin parka that you see pictured here, the absent body that this parka was made for, and her own body. Entitled We Wear One Another, the work was realized in collaboration with the parka, as well as with Apache violinist Laura Ortman and dancers Kaiwin Gobert and Dana Rosales. Through her extended engagement and through their extended engagement and the bodies that it came in dialogue with, new choreographies, new music, and new songs were enabled. The first question that the artist asked was how the parka itself could become a score for these new choreographies. The parka then traveled to the gallery in Kingston, Ontario, from the Manitoba Museum. But before it made its journey, she wanted to visit with it. By visiting with it, she was in proximity with it. She got to know it. She shared an intimacy with something made for and by the hands of her ancestors. She did this by gaining knowledge of the parka on its own terms. The parka, made from stitched and dried seal gut, was made for a very specific person. These are all custom made. It was made to fit their shoulders, to fit over the shape of his head, to fit snugly around his neck, to keep out icy water. It was sewn for the particular width of his torso, for the length of his arms. Every stitch was made carefully so that the garment was entirely waterproof, as these kinds of parkas are worn when out at sea, when you're in a kayak, which is a one-person boat, and the waist is attached to the boat to protect the paddler. The parka is a trace of them because it was a part of them. While at the Manitoba Museum, Tanya learned as much as she could about the migration of this cultural belonging, how the parka came to be in their holdings. These histories that are layered onto these belongings, when they come into museums, are often fragmented. They are often filled with gaps and silences. And more often than not, more is known about their collectors, mainly white men, than the name of who made the piece and the name of who she made it for. By simply being with this belonging, by spending time with this belonging, was it possible to amend some of these silences and gaps in knowledge and the attendant hierarchies in knowledge? For Luke and Linklater's collaborative work, which was realized as part of an ongoing exhibition that's traveling called Soundings, an exhibition in 5 parts, which is organized like a score, she asked the parka for permission to travel from Manitoba to Kingston, a journey of 2,279 kilometers. When it was shown in Kingston, she didn't want to replicate the usual museological frame, to place it on an armature that approximates the body, but instead to place it face up on a custom platform with its sides painted copper. There, the parka became the impetus for other bodies that danced, and as they danced, the sound of an electric violin pierced the air. Through creating a new process of being with this belonging, one that had languished in the storage of museums, she set in motion another set of protocols for performing repatriation otherwise. She did this first by visiting, taking the time to get acquainted with this particular piece. And then through a series of what she calls open rehearsals, it was embodied by the 2 dancers she frequently collaborates with and through the strings of Laura Ortman's violin. And I believe that it's through this proximity that she produced a new relation, an element that's integral to part of the repair of colonial violence that was predicated on the material dispossession of Indigenous people, as well as the erasure of us as people. And I can imagine that when the parka was returned to the Manitoba Museum, its place of permanent displacement, that it returned as a belonging, transformed. Thank you.
Thank you very much for great talks to both Itzel and Candice. I think it gave us a lot of questions to think about, but perhaps I will just unpack bit by bit by asking first to Candice that this idea of repatriation otherwise and how you sort of found its most poignant effect in contemporary artist practice, because we talk about museums practice as a given sort of condition sometimes, and repatriation has been talked about artifacts and returning of those objects, and you are actually questioning the very idea of object being the actual sort of holdings of belonging, or the sort of the articulation of their existence or way of living. So I think it's a really interesting idea, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how sort of this very interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary practices by certain contemporary artists could really give new forms to this object and making them more of the sort of the idea of belonging itself. Could you expand on that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. I've been thinking about this for quite some time, both based on, really studying the Umista Cultural Center, which I started with, and thinking about how even all of the things that they did, one, as I mentioned, refusing the term museum, refusing a term that has often fixed Indigenous people into specific, time periods, which are often in the past, never in the future. And even in the return of the potlatch items, they came now with these different protocols that were not based on the protocols of the belongings themselves. So they, of course, had to be kept in boxes, plexiglass boxes, despite, the kind of reordering that they enabled. So over the past number of years, I've been talking more with artists about how do we expand the idea of repatriation? Is it too predicated on the idea of just bringing things back? And when we bring things back, what happens if we still can't engage with them the way that we want to engage with them? And so this kind of opening up started happening, both on behalf of museums, to be fair, and on behalf of artists. So now places like the Museum of Anthropology at the University of British Columbia allows cultural items to be borrowed for ceremony. They don't place conditions on that borrowing because they understand that these have expanded social lives beyond, their being as holdings of museums themselves. So they're borrowed and then they're brought back. And from my understanding, those requests are not often ever denied, their role in communities. And so when Tanya started talking about this other kind of repatriation, what she wanted to do was to think not so much, what our sense of what this belonging needs, but instead kind of reversing it. How do we recenter the needs and agency of the belonging itself? So I think that that's where she started to move. And then where I was really intrigued too was this idea that repatriation is also in this proximity that she established. And in that proximity, part of that belonging became part of her body. And I think that that's where the choreography came out of, if that helps kind of unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and especially sort of thinking of the role of artist agency and also the viewers and how we learn that maybe lost or forgotten knowledge around those real objects. And my next question is to Itzel, and you talked quite interestingly about this paradox in a way of what's being contemporary and what's being indigenous, because you talk about these very contemporaneous, very core temporal artists who are working right now here, but who also sort of struggle and sometimes question their own heritage, and in terms of especially in language and territory when things are already lost. So how do you think that sort of this idea of contemporary, which is also a system in a way, and then when that sort of almost clashes with being indigenous as your subjectivity, do you see like some sort of a trend or some sort of a collective sort of approach to this maybe perceived paradox?
Pues los artistas que están presentes en la exposición, la mayoría de ellos tuvieron una formación artística. Su trabajo está hecho para funcionar, o está hecho con la intención de que participe en los procesos del circuito del arte. En ese sentido, pues sí está inserto en un sistema de lo contemporáneo, y son artistas que están dialogando con su contemporaneidad, ¿no? Eso era un punto sumamente relevante para la exposición, que fueran artistas que no estuvieran únicamente ocupados en estar reproduciendo símbolos, ideas, idiosincrasias de un pasado, sino autores que fueran capaces de negociar con un pasado que, insisto, no necesariamente tiene que ser precolombino, y con las problemáticas sociales reales que existen en el mundo actual. En el caso del lingüicidio, de la castellanización forzada, Es un tema que ahorita yo presenté solo algunos ejemplos, pero lo que es interesante es que en esta selección de artistas, varios de ellos transitan de una temática a otra y también tienen esta capacidad para experimentar con medios muy disímbolos entre sí. Pueden ir del video a la escultura, al bordado. Mauro Pech presentó, por ejemplo, una pieza en barro bordada, ¿no? Entonces, esta capacidad de experimentación formal es amplísima y creo que a diferencia una diferencia del proyecto de investigación de Candice y de los artistas presentes en los huecos del agua es que esa negociación con el pasado es a partir de lo simbólico más que de lo material, ¿no? Por ejemplo, Octavio Aguilar en el video que vimos, donde aparece su abuela haciendo referencia a los mitos fundacionales de los Ayuk, está recuperando esa historia, pero para contraponerla con la filosofía punk, ¿no? Hay un cruce de información constante entre el pasado y el presente. Los tlacolulocos están en un territorio donde hay tráfico de drogas y tráfico de armas, entonces sus mujeres por eso aparecen representadas por un lado con vestimenta considerada como tradicional, pero al mismo tiempo con tatuajes, con iPhones, con tenis de marcas estadounidenses. Es una constante ir y venir entre el pasado y el presente.
Thank you, Itzel. And as you are sort of coming from two different sort of artistic communities, if we can say, not just using current nation divides, but as we are looking at the Americas as our context for this event, obviously Mexico and Canada, the current states, and also all this sort of very heterogeneous traditions and cultures of different communities of indigenous peoples. There was a question from the audience to maybe speak to you both, sort of whether you could actually see some sort of convergences or some dialogues or possibilities of conversations and perhaps even questions. So yeah, if you could maybe have a kind of a question and answer to each other, what would be that sort of whether that is based on this the difference between two different sort of cultural contexts, or that is sort of a curator's approach as curators, how you approach to these sort of collective issues, and how that sort of the relationship between different cultures and nations and traditions might actually work in thinking of more of connected networks or solidarity. Who would like to go first?
I can begin. So thank you for that question. You know, I think that often our kind of histories and situations, as Itzel was saying, as Indigenous peoples are very much predicated by very specific kinds of colonial narratives. Canada's narrative is quite insidious because they still have this kind of guise of innocence in the colonial project, whereas, you know, my understanding in Mexico is really predicated on this idea, a false idea of conquest, which then, you know, puts us up with different kinds of barriers, I think. And I'm more interested in, instead of always having to kind of speak back to those contexts, is finding the ways that we can speak to each other, to one another. And there have been a number of very different kinds of dialogues and collaborations, particularly among resistance movements, of course, Indigenous resistance movements, which is highly influenced ones that take place in Canada as well. And they're continuing to, you know, think about how we define and understand Indigenous sovereignty, for example. So that's one of them. I would say that, you know, when Idle No More happened I definitely look to the indigenous resistance movements, the historical ones particularly as well in Mexico. It's all, I don't know, that's at least a beginning.
Yo también creo que se están fortaleciendo o ensanchando los diálogos a partir de lo que significa conocer desde otros parámetros la producción artística de pueblos originarios, y el reconocimiento se da desde distintos lados, indudablemente. En el caso de México o más bien voy a hablar en el caso de este proyecto expositivo, el punto de partida fue cuestionar todas las certezas que había alrededor de qué significaba arte contemporáneo indígena, ¿no? Desde cuestionar por qué es contemporáneo y por qué no, y por qué le vamos a llamar indígena. De ahí que haya evitado utilizar ese término en el título de la exposición y limitarlo simplemente a un tema de tiempo, ¿no? Es arte actual de pueblos originarios, justamente para partir de la pregunta y de la necesidad de desaprender. Y creo que hay ya varios esfuerzos que apuntan hacia estudiar desde otro lado, hacia escuchar sobre todo, ¿no? Porque como si no escuchamos lo que los autores, lo que los pensadores nos tienen que decir directamente, no tendría sentido nosotros elucubrar teorías y aproximaciones, ¿no? A mí, en cuanto al caso de Canadá, me llamó mucho la atención el programa que hizo la SBC Gallery con Pip Day, de invitar a la Woodland School a ocupar el espacio de la galería durante un año y que ellos fueran los que propusieran la programación del espacio. Me pareció algo extremo, valiente y congruente con esta necesidad de dejar que otras voces sean las que hablen.
It's the Sadie Bronfman Center, right, where they gave the entire year of programming over to artists. Is that correct? In Montreal? With Pip Day, I believe, yeah.
Yeah, I think the diversity and sort of the heterogeneous strength of indigenous practice are really well presented and understood in the more transnational context, because nation states and these borders are pretty artificial in many ways when we think about indigenous practice in any case. And it is interesting to see how this sort of different manifestations of similar experience could also open up some discussions for future activism. And the next question is firstly to Candice, but I think Itzel, you might also have some things to add. It has been announced that in the next Venice Biennial of Art, the Nordic Pavilion will be Sami Pavilion. It will be transformed into the pavilion of a nation, the newly recognized nation of Sami, but also it relates to what you said as sort of as a museum practice, museum frame, and how these international biennials are also quite different from what we experience and sort of represent in a museum context, firstly, but also how do we really sort of make sure these sort of new initiatives of tackling these challenges head-on in international platforms. What do we do to make sure that is not really hijacked as more of this like continuing and expanding inclusion?
Yeah, good question. And for those who haven't seen it, for the first time, the Nordic Pavilion will be not only renamed, but feature work by 3 Sami artists from the territory that is called Sapmi and has been for a long time, and it's a trans-border territory of Norway, Sweden, Western Russia, and Finland. But I wanted to maybe take that a couple steps back. When I first visited Sami Parliament in Norway, which is modeled in a way, as you would imagine, almost like a kind of small version of United Nations, where there's seats and they're within the circle of an architectural lavu, or a Sami traditional house. So they've turned that into a meeting house. And their constitution is hung in the library. It's printed on reindeer hide. But one of the questions that came up during our visit was from an artist, and she asked, why, if you were trying to do something different, did you replicate the structure and form of the nation state in creating your parliament? So I think sometimes there's a risk in, when we want to have a voice as Indigenous people, we think that the only way that we can do it, at least initially, is through kind of these very specific colonial forms. One of the, I think, critiques, obviously, of Venice is it originated out of the World Fairs, so it is based on a kind of nation state. So will their subversion of that by kind of renaming, does that subvert it? Does it create a different sense of a nation state? I don't think it does, because one of the major confusions when I was working on Documenta, when we invited many Indigenous artists to participate, including those from Sapmi, was people were very confused and didn't always see a difference between nationalism and Indigenous sovereignty. So I think that one of the most important conversations that must be had in this renaming is precisely that distinction.
Itzel, do you have some more thoughts on these exhibition models?
Sí. Pienso que es muy peligroso la representación, en el caso de México en concreto, la representación nacional a partir de la apropiación de los pueblos originarios es muy contradictoria. En México hay un uso del poder simbólico de las distintas culturas originarias en beneficio del Estado también, mientras hay proyectos extractivistas, mientras hay consultas falsas, mientras hay racismo, mientras hay discriminación. Entonces, justo ahí es donde creo que se tiene que abrir el debate, ¿no? En no hacer simplemente un uso y más bien escuchar. Hay concursos sobre lenguas indígenas, en literatura se abren cada vez más espacios y se pueden hacer exposiciones que vayan y muestren de qué se trata el arte huichol, pero mientras se sigan matando indígenas por defender su territorio, pues resulta totalmente inútil que sucedan este tipo de eventos de difusión de la riqueza, ¿no? Porque además este país es multicultural solamente cuando conviene, ¿no?
That's also really right to point out. And that sort of leads me to the next question about this situation, the condition of dislocation and dispossession. And when the sort of this hegemonic power of colonial sort of legacies are so preeminent, and also what it almost feels like the sort of almost to the total negation of indigenous people's presence, how the sort of this artistic effort could really invigorate this effort and direction and steer to make, however dispowered and very non-existent almost, how do we sort of make that sort of a step towards the future when there seems to be really nothing left? I think you might have some ideas with the artist you've shown before.
Sí, yo creo que este conjunto de artistas, y hay otros, hay varios, evidentemente, siempre hay un límite de espacio y de tiempo, ¿no? Pero hay muchos autores y pensadores, y desde distintos medios se está ampliando la discusión, el debate sobre otras maneras de reconocer lo que está sucediendo entre los pueblos originarios. Y ayer estaba escuchando a una conferencia que tuvimos en el museo con la lingüista Yasnaya Elena, y ella decía, es que ella es una activista que defiende la batalla lucha en contra de la desaparición de las lenguas originarias, y decía, es que para mí la lucha en defensa de las lenguas es inseparable a la lucha de defensa de los territorios, ¿no? Y hace completamente sentido. Entonces, creo que el punto es esto, y también voltear a ver un punto importantísimo a los pensadores de pueblos originarios, a la gente que está estableciendo las líneas de reflexión para pedir que las relaciones sean más simétricas, ¿no? Que dejemos de hacer simplemente un uso indebido de sus culturas, que son diversas de por sí, y que los dejemos de ver como un bloque homogéneo, y antes que todo respetemos su autonomía y sus derechos.
Yeah, Itzel, you bring up a good point, that, you know, when we think about repatriation, it's not just about cultural belongings, it's about language and land, because one of the colonial projects, of course, to undermine Indigenous agency is to displace us. It's also to get rid of our languages, which Canada was very effective with their residential schools, and that kind of like generations of abuse and shame that were attached to Indigenous language still lives on. But I wanted to actually speak to a very specific example, and that's with one of the artists who's in fact now representing the new Sapmi Pavilion, and that's Merit Anasara. She began her career as a journalist, and through her art practice actually used it as a platform for direct action. At the time, and continuing, the Norwegian government was enacting what they called a reindeer herding ban, and they were requiring particularly younger herders to cull their herds up to 50% in some instances. So what we did work towards as part of Documenta 14 was, one, to actually make visible the kind of insidious nature of colonial laws and how they do this through, you know, their own kinds of protocols. So we printed the entire document of what's called the Reindeer Act. It was translated, it was in Norwegian, in English, and then later also intended to be translated into Sami. And it was 11 meters long when you printed out it in its entirety. So it's another kind of example of colonial control. And when this act came to be, what Maratana did with her brother, who's a herder, was to take the heads of all the reindeer that they were forced to cull and to stack them in front of the courthouse, to make visible, you know, the effects this was having on very particular people. But this wasn't just about the Reindeer Act and the ban on herding. It was another way to control Sami reindeer herders, especially the northern people, to control their movements, to control their territories. And ultimately, because of climate change and the thawing of the permafrost and the tundra, that means that this opens this area up to more oil and gas exploration. So the more that you can control those herds and lessen them, the more you can open up Sapmi territory for more extraction. So they took their fight all the way up to the Supreme Court level. They won at all the lower level courts except for the Supreme Court. So in a way, she used her artwork and the visibility that enabled, so making that call visible as a very specific political action.
I think that's very also timely to think about how art is so much related to the current issues and activism and a real change in people's lives as well. And with all this sort of indigenous practices, it's also quite linked to what's been discussed in racial terms. And with Black Lives Matter and these things, there have been also a very big awareness about indigenous issues too. So, I mean, could you both maybe tell a little bit about how this sort of a more heightened awareness of racial inequality might have impacted discussions around indigenous issues?
I can begin. So here where I live now in New Mexico, there's definitely a solidarity movement between Black and Indigenous peoples. Where it's, I think, had its most effect is to reframe what were, I think, previously considered somewhat kind of inert monuments. So in New Mexico, there have been the removal of a number of monuments to conquistadors, one very near our house, which turned violent. One of our friends was shot. He survived. He was shot 3 times by a militia member, or someone who was a sympathizer, sorry, with the militia. And another Oñote monument was removed outside of Santa Fe as well. And I think it marked a very particular kind of rupture where not only could these monuments not be tolerated anymore, but they could no longer be seen as innocent or sort of like, a gesture of a particular kind of commemoration. And because that was in the past, that it didn't have an impact now. So it's definitely opened up these conversations. And just 2 days ago, they toppled an obelisk in the center of Santa Fe that was dedicated to Confederate soldiers, and inscribed at its base was, and it had been chipped away in the 1990s, the term savages for Native peoples. So I think that it's starting to evoke something of a historical reckoning, a very particular one here.
Yo creo que también aquí en México se ha traído como al debate público esta necesidad de pensar y de vivir desde un modo más justo y más inclusivo. La verdad es que desafortunadamente creo que sí sigue habiendo un modo de pensamiento desde el racismo y desde la discriminación muy fuerte. Había en la última encuesta que se hizo de discriminación de 2017, había un gran porcentaje de la población que pensaba que justificaba el nivel de pobreza entre los indígenas por ser indígenas, ¿no? Lo cual es pues sumamente peligroso. De ahí que aunque aparentemente se están dando pasos para llevar para que estas reflexiones lleven a modos de relación más justos, creo que son totalmente incipientes, y en este país por lo menos falta mucho por hacer. Justo esta semana salió un artículo que se llama La nueva guerra de la conquista y la defensa del territorio, y brevemente les voy a leer nada más el inicio. Dice: Oscar Eiraud Adams, del pueblo Umiau, fue asesinado a balazos el 24 de septiembre de 2020 en Baja California. Jesús Miguel Jerónimo y su hijo Jesús Miguel Jr. del pueblo Purépecha de Ichán fueron asesinados a balazos el 23 de julio de 2020 en Michoacán. Josué Bernardo Marcial Santos, conocido como Tío Bat, rapero y delegado del pueblo Popoluca al Congreso Nacional Indígena, fue encontrado muerto el 16 de diciembre. Todos tenían elementos en común, eran indígenas, defensores del territorio y lograban abrir diálogos y generar convergencias dentro y fuera de sus comunidades. Este es el contexto. Si hay aparentemente una apertura a reflexionar, a pensar en cuáles son estos símbolos que nos inculcaron como nacionales, pero el contexto mexicano sigue siendo muy complejo en ese sentido.
It's also very, very interesting. When we think about this more sort of practice-based kind of way, we have so many artists working in what is sort of understood as socially engaged practice and community-based practice. And it comes from all sort of directions. And we had a sort of keynote speaker for our section of Geopoetics, actually Colectivo Tirani on Tuesday, and they gave a very interesting talk around their sort of engagement with the actual community, but also how they work as a collective, sort of almost negating this idea, this singular authorship. Sometimes this sort of Western-centric ideas really insist on. And also that links to my previous question to you, Itzel, around this indigenous and contemporary paradox, perhaps, or that sort of perceived conflict. But they do show works in museum frame, of course, as you know, but their sort of work is really pretty embedded into the community. So how do we sort of translate their a real engagement with the community when it comes to exhibition without actually making it as a tokenized kind of gesture? That was a question from one of our audiences.
Creo que pienso que hacerlo en sus propios términos y que la interpretación de esos elementos que van a participar del criterio curatorial sean dados por los mismos autores. Por ejemplo, las piezas que nosotros exhibimos de creadores zapatistas, aparecía como tenían un dueño, evidentemente, pero se les preguntó a los autores, no al coleccionista, si estaban de acuerdo en que las obras participaran en la exposición, ¿no? Tuvieron que conocer de qué se trataba la exposición y la autorización la tenía que dar, la tenían que dar los autores. Exhibimos un bordado que fue una colaboración de los Panteras Negras y los zapatistas del colectivo Zapanteras, y fue en esos términos. Y, por ejemplo, en la lista de autores, ellos prefirieron aparecer como colectivo transdisciplinario de investigaciones críticas.
Thank you. And maybe my next question can be also to both of you. And it is around how, as curators, we represent these practices, but we also work with artists to create new context. And when the sort of the behaviors and importance and the meanings are so much embedded in the sort of cultural heritage and very much live heritage that is also the present, and when you have to sort of mediate through and facilitate these differences in conception of art itself, but also all this framework of the institutional practice. So how do you stop this decontextualizing happening? How do you really retain the integrity of their culture? Candice, perhaps you could start.
Sure. That's a great question. And I know that there's many ways and they're all evolving, and some have been pointed to already, like this idea of what collectivity does to questions of authorship and also forging, stronger links between community. One of the things that we did when I worked on the exhibition Sagahan, which was a look at indigenous practices from kind of globally, was we never reframed the artist's words. In every opportunity, we had direct quotes from the artists speaking about their work themselves. Because so often I think not only have indigenous artists been poorly contextualized, but much of what their work means has not been said by us. We also interviewed every single artist and made those interviews available within the gallery as well. I think that it was really important to, one, do away with the kind of tropes of anthropology that still seep into a lot of exhibitions of indigenous art. One, not adhering to kind of cartographic curatorial practices, for example, placing people kind of on a map. I still find that like really, really problematic, because what do you do if someone's a migrant, whether forced or by choice? What do you do when someone's living in a city, for example? I think another really important part of that, and this has now shifted the museological practices at the National Gallery of Canada as well, is that every work that's shown, no matter in what gallery, whether it's the historical galleries or the contemporary galleries, the label is in the artist's indigenous language first, before English, before French. So again, sort of trying to go against kind of the kind of tropes of national languages as well. The Art Gallery of Ontario takes that one step further, where every label, no matter where an artist is from, they could be from Beijing, for example, it's the first language you see the label in is Algonquin, so the language of the land. So I think increasingly there's a kind of turn in curatorial practices to thinking about what the protocols of the particular place are and how those start to influence curatorial practices.
Estoy de acuerdo con Candice, creo que lo principal es escuchar la voz de los artistas, desde dónde es que están trabajando, hacia dónde va su práctica, y esa tiene que ser la información con la que se encuentra el visitante de las exposiciones. Creo que indudablemente hay mucho todavía en lo cual hay que trabajar. Creo que estamos apenas empezando, pero es fundamental no dar lecturas a algo que no se entiende, ¿no? Tiene que ser el propio autor el que arroje la información para entenderlo en la dimensión adecuada y no caer en esta necesidad de interpretación colonialista que ya tuvimos cientos de años de esto.
It's also a really important point. And perhaps, I mean, before we conclude, because we did have quite a lot of questions, but some we distilled and some we converged. So I think we have covered quite a lot of comments and questions from the audience. But if Candice and Itzel, you have any sort of questions or comment to really to the audience or suggestions you want to really say, I think this is the time before we go.
I think we both went quiet.
Maybe my framing was not quite right, but I just wanted to give you both a chance to maybe talk about something you felt missing from what you've already said. You've covered quite a lot, that's for sure. So I have given you the chance, and I think you are fairly content with what we discussed. So yeah, I'd like to just reiterate the importance of this thinking of a continent and thinking of a planet in a way. And we are very wary of all these globalizing forces and all these neoliberal and exploitatory sort of ways of our sort of existence and different types of living. But what we can really sort of demand in a way is to have the space and to have that sort of right very intact to talk about these things and to channel and convey all these desires in the right way. And we want to give that platform, but also we want to be those sort of people who can work together. And I think that this sort of what we talk about as transnational, transcultural, and in a way to go against all this sort of linear idea of time itself is to really make these different values all be heard and seen and experienced. So one of the sort of aims of this event was to understand what we don't know, but also reiterate what we already know and feel very strongly about. And we have 2 more weeks of these discussions and people sort of talking from their own point of view, but really sharing that passion and that sort of commitment. And I would like to thank both Candice and Itzel very enormously. And it's been really great to hear your very thoughtful responses to the questions as well as your presentations. And the next event is taking place on Tuesday, October the 20th. Ticio Escobar will be our keynote speaker, and it will start at 10 a.m. Mexico City time and 4 p.m. London time. And I really do hope that you will be able to come back and perhaps bring your colleagues and friends as well. And thank you for the speakers, but also all our audiences who've stayed with us and given us such interesting and thoughtful questions. I hope that we've done justice for your participation. So thank you all, and please join us again soon.
Thank you.